occupation. Historically, Romania consisted of three regions: Wallachia, Moldova, and Transylvania. Starting from the 16th century, the regions were under Turkish control. In the early 19th century, the Russian Empire began pushing the Ottoman boundaries in the Balkans. After the end of the Russo-Turkish War, a peace treaty was signed in Bucharest in 1812. The Moldovan Principality lost Bessarabia, which became part of the Russian Empire. This is the moment when the Russian expansion began in the Balkans. Romania was completely liberated from Turkish rule in 1878. It created an independent state, which no longer included Bessarabia. Self-determination, Russian style. In 1917, the Bolsheviks sweep to power in a coup. World War I facilitates the disintegration of the Russian Empire, leading to the downfall of the Romanov dynasty. The Bolshevik Revolution speeds up the dissolution of the empire, and independent states begin emerging in the former colonies. In November 1917, Bessarabia forms a national assembly, the Sfatul Tsari, which announces the creation of a Moldovan Democratic Republic in December of that year. The Moldovan Republic was endangered from the first day of its existence. Red Army divisions, which deserted the Romanian front and switched to the Bolshevik side, began a Red Terror in Bessarabia. The region plunged into anarchy while the Russian soldiers go on a looting spree. In January 1918, the Moldovan government appeals to Romania for help. After a short battle, January 13th, the Bolsheviks are pushed back and Romanian troops enter Chisinau. The communists depart from Moldovan territory. The Romanian army's entrance into Bessarabia triggers a negative reaction in Moscow. The Kremlin considers Bessarabia its own territory. Therefore, Russia breaks off diplomatic relations with Romania. In order to avoid a new Bolshevik invasion, the Sfatul Tsari decides to unite Bessarabia with its historical mainland, Romania. Bessarabia's National Assembly finalizes the decision to unite with the Kingdom of Romania on March 27, 1918. Bessarabia, or Moldova, which is considered a part of the Russian Empire since 1812, reunites with its historical motherland. The decision was made by the 86 members of the National Assembly. The Historical Union Act reads, "Based on the historical and kinship rights of the principle that the people themselves must decide their fate, Bessarabia, torn away from the body of ancient Romania over 100 years ago by Russia, is entering an eternal union with Mother Romania." The Kremlin interprets Bessarabia's union with Romania as annexation and refuses to recognize its legitimacy. Moscow claims that Bessarabia was inhabited not by Romanians, but by a separate ethnicity, Moldovans, who desired state independence.
В тот момент, когда Бессарабия присоединилась к Румынии, Советы объявили о том, что они не признают.
At the time when Bessarabia was united with Romania, the Soviet powers announced that they did not recognize the union as legitimate and began to conduct so-called partisan warfare, especially from 1922 to 1940. Subversive partisan gangs who crossed over from one side of the Dniester River from 1922 to 1936 killed 3,400 policemen, border guards, and military officers.
граничерь, это пограничников и военных.
The Soviets create the Moldovan Autonomous Republic on October 12, 1924, which becomes a part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
В 1924 году образовали за Днестром Молдавскую автономную республику, где молдаване составляли процентов 30.
They formed the Moldovan Autonomous Republic beyond the Dniester in 1924 on the territory with about 30% Moldovans, but they called it a Moldovan Republic. What's interesting is that according to the maps of the time, the republic spread until the Dniester riverbank, although contemporary school textbooks showed that the border surpassed the Dniester River and included the territory of modern-day Moldova. It reflected the imperialist, expansionist ambitions of the Soviet Union at the time. The Autonomous Republic became a political tool in Moscow's hands. The Bolsheviks assumed that an autonomous area where Moldovans comprised just 30% of the population should become Russia's springboard for annexing Bessarabia and Sovietizing Romania. This republic became a poster republic, with all the related conditions quickly created in the region of Transnistria. They formed a national theater, built a building for it, and a printing press and a university, which was called a pedagogical institute at the time. They used to bring over Romanian journalists to show them the achievements of the new republic. Those journalists who saw only the surface of the changes reported in Romanian media on the changes in the Moldovan Republic, saying that the workers there were free, the farmers were well off, and that they have a theater and everything. In short, all the things that failed to be created under the Romanian regime existed in Bessarabia. It had a massive impact. The Soviets began a propaganda campaign to present the Moldovans as a separate nation. The Moldovan language was announced independent from Romania, and its Latin alphabet was replaced with Cyrillic. The Moldovans were being infused with the idea that they were not Romanians, but a different, separate ethnicity. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union gained an opportunity to once again annex Bessarabia. Hitler's Nazi Party came to power in Germany in 1933. The Führer, who wanted to regain territories Germany lost after World War I, sought allies in Europe. The Communists did the same, and were also on a quest to resurrect an empire. The two totalitarian regimes reach a consensus. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Russian Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov sign a non-aggression pact in Moscow, August 23, 1939. The secret protocol of the agreement divides spheres of influence, with the Soviet Union obtaining a carte blanche for Poland, the Baltic region, Finland, and Bessarabia. The partition of Europe begins with the Polish campaign in September 1939. It takes the Kremlin a week to annex the territories of eastern Poland. Russian troops enter the Baltic region in October. While in November, Stalin begins his military operation against Finland. The plan to impose the Soviet doctrine on Finland fails after 3 months of fighting, although Moscow succeeds in annexing most of the country's territory. Finland loses the Karelian Isthmus and strategically important islands in the Baltic Sea. In the summer of 1940, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are fully Sovietized. After stabilizing its positions on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht begins its attack on France in June 1940. On June 14th, German troops enter Paris. Stalin congratulates Hitler with the capture of Paris and calls the event a victory over French imperialism. Romania, France's main ally, now faces the threat of a possible Soviet invasion. Molotov sends a note to Bucharest, June 26, 1940, in which the Kremlin proposes that Romania remove its troops from Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Should Romania refuse, Moscow threatens war. By this time, the situation in Europe was such that Romanian King Carol II must accept the Soviet ultimatum. Romanian troops depart Bessarabia and northern Bukovina without a fight. There was pressure from Nazi Germany not to resist by military means, because Germany would not support the resistance, and Romania would end up isolated. Romania also had a problem with Hungary, which had claims on its northern region of Transylvania. It also had a problem with Bulgaria, which had claims against its southern regions. Romania was in fact encircled, with no one to help it. There existed an alliance treaty with Poland, but it was already occupied by that time. Therefore, it was difficult to find a reasonable decision. Furthermore, there was an internal crisis in the country. So when the Royal Council convened to make the decision, only 3 people voted in favor of a military response to the Soviet troops. That is why they eventually decided to withdraw. Led by General Zhukov, Soviet troops forced their way into Dniester on June 28, 1940, and began to occupy Romanian territory. "100,000 soldiers and over 1,000 tanks were involved in the operation.
Они вошли с танками, с десантом, заняли всю линию на пруте и попутно заняли.
They invaded with tanks, paratroopers, occupying everything in their path, taking part of Bukovina along the way, as well as a small region called Herza, which was not covered by the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement. The historians explained after that Stalin used a very thick pencil when he marked the map, thus marking an extra 15 to 50 kilometers so that the tanks just covered it, marking the border at the point where they stopped. By June 1928, Soviet troops occupy almost all major towns in Bessarabia. Within 3 days, the occupation troops had stationed themselves along the shore with the river Prut and closed off the Soviet-Romanian state border. The communists celebrate the annexation of Bessarabia with a celebratory parade in Chisinau. July 3rd, 1940. The center of Chisinau is covered with red flags and communist slogans. A military parade is held in the city, marking the Sovietization of Bessarabia. The communists place a bandstand in Chisinau's Central Park. General Georgy Zhukov ascends the stage at 2 in the afternoon. He addresses the Soviet military and the residents of the city with the words, "Today, the Red Army completed the task of the Soviet government and Comrade Stalin, freeing Bessarabia from Romanian invaders. You are now the creators of your own lives. You should not work for the capitalists, but for the glorification of your great motherland." იმ დღეებში 200,000 people moved from Bessarabia to Romania at the time. fleeing the territories now occupied by the communists. The Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic was created on the occupied territories on August 2, 1940. It includes 6 districts of the former Bessarabian Governorate and 6 regions of the former Moldovan Autonomous Republic. The remaining territory is annexed to Ukraine.
Определение или очертание границы будущей Молдавской Советской Социалистической Республики состоялось не из этнических...
The boundaries of the future Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic were not based on ethnic, but rather geostrategic grounds, because the southern part of contemporary Bessarabia was torn away, with 4 regions given to Ukraine, and the northern regions of Bukovina and Hertsa, which were also annexed to Ukraine. Only 6 regions of the Moldovan Autonomous Republic were given in return, out of 14. This partition deprives Bessarabia of its historic territory. Chisinau becomes the capital of the new republic. Around 3 million people were living in Moldova at the time.
Оккупация происходила очень быстро, то есть
The occupation was carried out very quickly. Special trains brought people from Russia and Ukraine, who occupied all the posts of rural and regional council chairmen, teachers, etc. In the blink of an eye, the entire space was occupied by Soviet people who did not speak the language and were in no way related to the place. These were people who received clear-cut instructions that they realized. They came in saying, "I'm the new chairman, I have the seal." They created some groups and started to operate. The nationalization process was very fast. All businesses previously controlled by the Romanian government, as well as the land, were nationalized. Individual private land plots were limited to 10 hectares in Bessarabia, where agriculture provided the main source of income for the majority. They introduced a rapid currency change which badly affected the people, because the exchange rate did not correspond to the real value of the money. Right after the Sovietization of Bessarabia, the communists began repressions. Around 8,000 people are arrested and deported from the country in 1940.
В Кишиневе в 1940 году, до начала войны, до июня 1941, они расстреляли...
In 1940, and right until the beginning of the war in June 1941, they shot at least 200 to 300 people, based on the traces that were discovered. They included clergymen, politicians, and police officers. They would get arrested, interrogated, shot, and buried in secret. The biggest repression operation implemented by the Soviets happened in June 1941. The People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs conducted punitive operations against all occupied territories. Populations of the Baltic region, Moldova, Bukovina, and the eastern provinces of Poland were to be deported. In 1939, these territories were annexed to Ukraine and Belarus. The Bolsheviks were thus trying to eradicate all anti-Soviet sentiments and to turn the new citizens into faceless, obedient masses of people. Moldova undergoes a process of total deportation on June 12th to 13th, 1941. The deportation of people unfavorable for the communist regime from the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic begins on the 12th to 13th of June 1941. The authorities evict members of various parties, the clergy, former landowners, state officials, police, and Russian Tsarist army officers. Everyone who had to leave was given 2 hours to gather their belongings. 29 cargo carriages were sent off from Chisinau's central railway station to Siberia and Kazakhstan, deporting 25,000 people from the country.
Когда нас погрузили в вагонах, там, значит, эти вагоны до нас вывозили скот, грязные.
We were loaded into wagons previously used to transport cattle. They were filthy. The floor wasn't covered even by a bit of straw. They were not cleaned after the cattle, and we were loaded into that dirt. There were small children like myself. There were pregnant women, women with infants, many of them dying from the heat. They wouldn't even allow the mothers to bury them. So the dead newborns were simply thrown out of the tiny windows, somewhere out into the field. They were probably eaten by wild animals.
Его выбросили через вот это вот маленькое окошечко прямо в поле где-то там, может быть, после этого дикие звери его, конечно, съедали.
Арестовали, ну, почти всех. То есть вся интеллигенция.
They arrested everyone, all the intellectuals, clergy, and even lyceum students from the higher grades.
Лицеев, старших классов. То есть это была самая мощная чистка, которая.
It was the most powerful cleansing that ever happened in Bessarabia. Only those who fled their homes on that night were able to save themselves. The deportation process was interrupted on June 22nd, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Fascists began a large-scale military operation. Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu joins Germany in declaring war against the Soviet Union. The 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, which are a part of Germany's Army Group South, invade Bessarabia on July 1st, 1941. The Romanian army completely liberates Bessarabia from Soviet troops by mid-August and re-annexes it to Romania. They also take the northern Bukovina region. Romania was to lose these territories again in 3 years. On August 22nd, 1944, the Red Army defeats the resistance and once again occupies the territory of Moldova. Soviet troops enter Bucharest, which would eventually lead to the Sovietization of all Romania. The communist era began in Bessarabia. The politics of the 1930s, which pushed towards the creation of an independent Moldovan nation and its estrangement from Romania, were introduced with new force after the war. The Soviets created a new Moldovan society that was not supposed to have any links with Romania.
После того, как значит, Советы опять же пришли на эту территорию, значит, и, соответственно, были определенные там мирные соглашения.
After the Soviets returned to this territory, a number of peace treaties followed. Under the pretext that fascist literature should be banned, they also banned our classical writers, the majority of which lived and wrote beyond the river Prut. Therefore, throughout the first 20 years of the occupation, we had no access to our classics. Instead of them, we had works written in poor Moldovan by some ambiguous writers, who were freshly baked beyond the other side of Dniester. Everything in Russian language was good, accepted, and dominant. This factor could be traced to the history of the Moldovans, starting from the ancient times. They grew up in a Slavic environment with the defining influence of Russia. There exists the theory that the annexation of Bessarabia, which freed it from the Turkish yoke, was a very positive factor, that it returned them to the Orthodox family, and that it was a sign of progress. The history of Moldova began to be formed on the basis of their difference with Romanians, with an accentuated influence on Russia. History was rewritten. There emerged new writers and scientists who tried to persuade the society that Moldovans were of separate ethnicity. The active Russification of Moldova began.
После 1944 года приезжали из России, Российской Федерации, очень много русских.
After 1944, there came these people from Russia. These Russians, Ukrainians, Slavs in other words, who were able to obtain flats here in a matter of weeks. The Moldovans that were allowed in Chisinau were ordinary workers who lived in dormitories, and it took them decades to receive even that accommodation, whereas those who arrived from Russia received the accommodation in no time. They began to systematically populate the region with ethnic Russians. The process was facilitated by the existence of large industrial sites on the left bank of the river Dniester, to which workers began arriving from Russian regions. This alley is located in Chisinau's Central Park. It is named after the classics of Moldovan literature. The alley was once the main meeting place of the leaders of the national movement. Starting from 1988, this is where the protest rallies, demonstrations, and manifestations were held. At the time, the national movement put forward several questions. Their demand was to assign Moldovan, i.e., the Romanian language, the status of a state language.
1988 год – это уже был год, когда начались серьезные движения. Начались митинги.
1988 was the year when some serious movements emerged. Rallies began in Chisinau, with the movement reaching a culmination in 1989, when they started demanding the Latin alphabet, the replacement of the national flag to a tricolor one, the legalization of the Romanian language. In other words, the demands became nationalistic.
Язык был румынский, то есть все такие требования уже национальные.
In spring 1989, the agenda of the Moldovan national independence movement included not only the question of the state language, but also the sovereignty of the republic. 100,000 people gathered on Chisinau's central square on June 25th. They protested against Bessarabia's annexation by Soviet Russia. Through 50 years of occupation, it was the first time that tens of thousands of people demonstrated their desire to leave the Soviet Union. Protest rallies were organized by a newly created National Front. In a short period of time, this union gained the full support of the population, becoming the leading force of the movement for national independence. In July 1989, the National Front increases its pressure on the authorities to resolve the issue of the state language. The national movement reaches its goal, with the Supreme Council publishing a law which for the first time throughout the Soviet occupation thoroughly changes the language norms. The Moldovan language is announced to be the only state language in the Republic. A massive rally of 2,000 people is held by the monument to Moldovan Prince Stefan cel Mare on August 27, 1989. People demand that the status of the Moldovan language be defined. On August 31st, under pressure from the protesters, the Supreme Council of Moldova decides at an emergency meeting to make Moldovan the state language, instead of Russian. The Latin alphabet would replace Cyrillic. Years later, after Moldova gained independence, it declares August 31st the Limba Noastră holiday, meaning our language. The Russian language had lost its dominant position, triggering a wave of protest among the Russian-speaking population in the Republic. The protest sentiments are particularly sharp in Transnistria, where the majority of the residents speak Russian only. Strikes begin in Tiraspol and several other cities where the protesters demand that the Supreme Council annul the law and return Russian as a state language, along with Moldovan.
Republica Moldova este un stat suveran, independent și democratic.
Chișinău does not succumb to the demands. The situation gradually intensifies. On June 23, 1990, Moldova's Supreme Council ratifies a declaration of the Republic's sovereignty and deemed the act of creating a Soviet Republic on the territory of Bessarabia illegal. This decision escalated tensions. The Gagauz ethnic group living in the south of Moldova declares an independent state on August 19th. Historians still dispute the origin of the Gagauz ethnicity. Some insist that their ancestors came from nomadic Turkic tribes. Others say that they are the descendants of Turkicized Bulgars. Another theory points to their Seljuk origin, saying that the ancestors of the Gagauz were Turks who settled in Dobruja, on the territory of modern-day Romania, in the 13th century. The Gagauz language is related to Turkish and belongs to the Oghuz language group. However, unlike Turks, Gagauz are Orthodox Christians. The first Gagauz settlements appeared in Moldova's territory in the 19th century, after the Russo-Turkish War. Since then, the Turkish-speaking Christians began living in the south of Moldova. A Gagauz autonomy exists today as a part of the Republic of Moldova, although this was not always the case. The region was on the brink of civil war in the early 1990s. Transnistria is next to proclaim its independence on September 2nd, 1990. The largest cities of the region, including Dubosari, Tiraspol, and Bendur, fully free themselves from the control of Central Moldovan authorities. The country finds itself divided along the Dniester river line. A volatile situation is also created in Gagauzia, which refuses to obey Chișinău. It was necessary to resist the nationalist movement in Chișinău because there was a high probability of unification with Romania, which the Moldovan population of Chișinău demanded. Therefore, a counterweight had to be created as soon as possible. The situation in Transnistria was not enough. There needed to be a seed of discord planted inside the movement itself. That's where the Gagauz Republic came into play. The Kremlin stood behind the creation of separatist movements in the Republic. The Soviet authorities were thus fighting with Moldova's independence. Along with financial aid, the separatists received military assistance from the 14th Army stationed in Transnistria. That summer, the leader of the self-proclaimed Republic of Transnistria, Igor Smirnov, conducts intensive consultations with the then Soviet Minister of Defense, Dmitry Yazov, and KGB chairman, Vladimir Khrushchev. During the meetings, Smirnov receives orders for further steps, with the separatists switching to an active phase on November 2nd. Illegal armed groups assault Dubosari's buildings of the Prosecutor General's office and the court, which are at the time under the Moldovan authorities' control. They then block the bridge across the Dniester River. The Dubosari Bridge across the Dniester is 150 meters long, linking the Transnistrian district with the rest of Moldova. The first serious armed clash erupted on this bridge in late 1990, when a national movement was activated in Moldova. The clashes led to bloodshed. On November 2nd, a group of Moldovan militia attempted to enter the city of Dubasari, situated on the other bank of the Dniester. Residents of the city see it as an armed attack against the self-proclaimed Republic of Transnistria and close off the bridge. 3 people died as a result of the clash, which was just the beginning. The armed conflict between the separatist Transnistria and the rest of Moldova would last 2 years and take the lives of 1,000 people. After the events in Dubasari, the separatists and Russian Cossacks forcefully occupied the administrative buildings in the cities of the self-proclaimed republic. Upon Smirnov's orders, Tiraspol begins forming a guard, with the process supervised by the officers of the 14th Soviet Army, stationed in Transnistria. On March 2, 1992, armed separatist divisions attack police headquarters in Dubasari and capture 35 Moldovan police officers. On the same day, acting upon the orders of the Moldovan government, special police units cross the Dniester River and confront the separatists. A full-scale armed conflict unravels in Transnistria.
Это был политический конфликт, который поддерживался извне великой державой, имеем в виду Российскую Федерацию, которая...
It was a political conflict which was externally supported by the Russian Federation, which openly interfered in the internal affairs of the Republic of Moldova with the help of its 14th Army, in order to apply all efforts for the creation of a Moldovan Transnistrian Republic in Tiraspol. Officially, the 14th Army was not to interfere, although in reality it was one of the active sides of the conflict. The separatists received their ammunition from the warehouses of the 14th Army. Officers, special units, and the armory of the 14th Army fought against the Moldovan government troops and police. The separatists were supplied with artillery equipment.
Зафиксировалось неоднократно прибытие казахских формирований.
Several Cossack brigades arrived. As far as I remember, in mid-March, the first party of 2,500 people arrived, with 700 to 800 more arriving every other week or so, until June, when the war ended. Therefore, there exist certain details that support the claim that it was all organized, including the issue with the criminals. You might have heard about it. Those criminals facing a death sentence or an execution were dispatched here by railway carriages. Some of them used to end up in Chisinau, probably by mistake, and were noted to be asking directions for Tiraspol. They would be arrested and questioned for revealing information about how they got there in the first place. It appears that they were freed, armed, and told to go to Transnistria. By May, the fighting had spread across the borders of Dubasari to the entire region.
Они лучше были вооружены, чем мы, но силам духом, не моим только духом, а силам духом всех солдат.
They were better armed than us, but our morale was much stronger. Every single soldier was so resolute to defend the Republic. They were ready to face any danger, face death. It's difficult to speak about all these issues, because war is such a bad thing. One has to kill and destroy. It's not so easy. By June, when Moldovan government troops had fully recaptured the town of Bender, Moscow interfered. On June 23rd, the commander of the 14th Army, General Alexander Lebedev, openly said that he would defend Transnistria with all possible means. July 3rd, the artillery division of the 14th Army opens intensive fire against Moldovan positions. I used to receive reports that the officers of the 14th Army were holding the positions, people we knew personally, because we used to live side by side in Tiraspol, in Bender. The 14th Army had divisions stationed in both directions. We came face to face with the 14th Army in the town of Tigina on the battlefield. It became evident that Chisinau would be unable to defeat the Russian army. On that day, Moldovan President Mircea Snegur calls the Russian President, Boris Yeltsin, and offers to begin peace talks. After signing the treaty, large-scale warfare in Transnistria ended. Under the pretext of peacekeeping troops, Moscow placed around 3,000 officers in the conflict zone in 1992, and Chisinau lost control over Transnistria. Moldova gave the territory populated by the Gagauz an autonomous status in 1994, thus putting an end to the confrontation. Despite Chisinau's numerous attempts, the Transnistrian problem still remains unresolved, not least because of Russia's position. At an OSCE summit in 1999, Moscow pledged to withdraw the 14th Army from Transnistria. In 2008, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced Russia would not follow through.
Дорогие приднестровцы, уважаемые гости.
To this day, the Russian government continues to provide economic and political aid to the separatists.
Поздравляю вас с государственным праздником всего приднестровского народа.
В начале 90-х годов Советский Союз распался, и мы стали независимыми государствами. Но
the Soviet Union fell apart in the early 1990s, and we became an independent state. But we, just like Georgia and others, had to pay a high price for this freedom. Because when the Soviet leaders understood that they were losing the territories that they had annexed, they created the Transnistria enclave here, and other similar conflicts that would create obstacles for the development of independence.
Такие анклавы, которые бы помешали бы развивать свою независимость.
First of all, we should admit, and I have said this before, that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century.